Thanks everyone for being here. I'm Patricia Fong, as you know. I was very honored to have been on this year's planning team and to engage with Reagan and Deborah and Amy, Gary, Cecil and Jamie, and also with our plenary speakers, Jonathan, Chet, Elaine, and Hannah, Sylvia with your preaching, Deborah, your liturgies, and Stephen Abram with your music. As you've heard, after lunch and the hike, I will be leading us in an art project. I want to help us enter into that project by sharing a bit about my own art that I hope will help the project be more meaningful for everyone who participates in it. I know that art, especially this sort of performance art and found object contemporary stuff that I do, it's not really within everyone's comfort zone. Some of us are really words people. I think a lot of people are words people. I know that my first instinct when faced with something difficult is to think super, super hard. I prefer there be a big pile of books and maybe some scholarly references. This is a very different kind of mode than that. So by introducing you to some of my other art, I'm hoping that what we'll do this afternoon will feel accessible to everyone, or at least worth entering into, trying to give you kind of something to hold on to. So during this half hour, I'm going to talk about my art for a bit, and then I will introduce the Grief Braid Project. And at the end, I will do a reading from my essay poem Grief Web, which is the one that I sent out in the pre-gathering materials. If I were to summarize what my work is as an artist, I would say it is to foster multi-species interdependence through mourning practices, to make precarious life amidst capital ruins. That's a phrase I borrow from the writer Anna Singh. To foster what Donna Haraway calls responsibility, becoming able to respond in the shadow of death, to mourn in particular for those who die before their time. That phrase, die before their time, comes from Gustavo Gutierrez's definition of the poor. The poor are those who die before their time, and Ruth Wilson Gilmore's definition of racism, the production and exploitation of group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. Premature death. My work takes the form of site-specific installations, meaning something that's made for a particular place at a particular time, made of discarded material I find in discarded places. I think of these installations as embodied poetry and embodied prayer, the kind of prayer that happens in bodies, in place, in community, the kind of prayer that is precarious, modeled after Chilean indigenous artist Cecilia Vicuña's poem Precario. Precario es lo que se obtiene por oración, inseguro, apurado o escase. Precarious is what is obtained by prayer, uncertain, exposed to hazards, insecure. I call these practices and artworks the grief web. I started making the grief web during a season in which there was great loss in my life and in my family's life. I lost friends, and my friends lost friends. I lost family, and my family lost family. At the same time, there was catastrophe after catastrophe around the world. Here in California, there were mass shootings and the fires, every year the fires. And there were the police killings of 2020, which included the killing of a young man named Sean Monterosa, who went to high school in my neighborhood. In 2022, the journalist Shireen Abu Akleh, a Palestinian Christian, was shot in the head by an Israeli sniper, and at her funeral, the IDF attacked her pallbearers. And there was, of course, the pandemic. Some of the catastrophes I felt deeply personally affected by, some for reasons I couldn't explain, and sometimes because I was connected to them by place, by people, or because of my politics and racialization. And today there continues to be catastrophe upon catastrophe, shootings, fires here and elsewhere, and my work continues, especially here at this gathering with you all. In this current season, I have been particularly thinking of Palestine and lamenting the genocide in Gaza. In those catastrophes, especially the ones that I was personally connected to, two weapons kept showing up over and over: the car and the gun. Guns and cars, and all the infrastructures and industrial complexes that create them and are connected to them. For the first time, I started noticing, really noticing, the road-killed animals along the freeways. And once I started noticing, I began to feel for the first time the immensity of that form of eco-death. Road-killed animals became the central image, an icon of catastrophe, creatures that die before their time who are not mourned, and whose deaths I feel personally responsible for as a driver and as an American and as a human, deaths that I felt and feel helpless to prevent, but also obligated to mourn. During that season, it was extremely difficult for me to write. The words just wouldn't come. This was especially true when I tried to respond to the unfathomable loss of climate change and extinction, and words just wouldn't come when I was trying to respond to the deaths of 3 young men in my neighborhood, old classmates of mine who were killed in shootings, which happened in 1 week when I was away at college. I was tied up in a confused tangle of grief and guilt, and the feeling that because I was estranged from my old community, I didn't have the right to feel grief as strongly as I was feeling it. I felt that I had to respond to these deaths, and that all the art I was making was for those young men. And at the same time, I felt that I didn't have the right to make art about them at all. During that period of wordlessness, I was also wrestling with and sometimes giving into a kind of grief that became a desire to harm others or to harm myself. Loss made me face my vulnerability, and that made me feel violent. I found what I was experiencing in Judith Butler's precarious life, putting them here. When negotiating a sudden and unprecedented vulnerability, what are the options? There is the possibility of repudiating vulnerability itself. Nothing about being socially constituted as other restrains us from simply becoming violent ourselves. And then there is the other age-old option, the possibility of wishing death or becoming dead as a vain effort to preempt or deflect the next blow. It was non-human creatures, multi-species communities, and the extinction studies scholars who write about them that gave me a path out of this spiral. These creatures taught me that vulnerability is inherent to interdependence, that vulnerability before the other is an embodiment of our connection, of our reliance on each other. As Judith Butler writes in Precarious Life, we are from the start given over to the other, vulnerable to a range of touch that includes the eradication of our being at the one end and the physical support for our lives at the other. These communities taught me to situate my grief within a web of much greater loss, loss that is cross-cut, that is held communally. Following these creatures, my grief, rather than being isolating and totalizing, wove me into the world, helping me become with the world and become together with other creatures. These communities I am speaking of are corvid species, especially magpies, and vultures, especially turkey vultures. The extinction studies scholar Tom Van Doren was my guide to see magpies and vultures anew. Tom Van Doren writes about how magpies are social creatures who have their own mourning practices. This anecdote in particular stuck with me. Quote, while traveling through the mountains in Colorado, ethologist Mark Bethoff witnessed a gathering of magpies in which 4 of these birds were standing by a 5th, likely killed by a car. One approached the corpse, gently pecked at it, and stepped back. Another magpie did the same thing. Next, one of the magpies flew off, brought back some grass, and laid it by the corpse. Another magpie did the same. Then all 4 magpies stood vigil for a few seconds, and one by one flew off. Reading this, I looked up videos online of mourning magpies and found several in which the birds do as Beckhoff describes. In these videos, the magpies also turn their heads backwards towards the sky and let loose a terrible mournful cry over and over and over again. Van Doren writes that corvid species mourn because they are bound up in each other's lives, because they are at stake in each other. Mourning is a practice of creatures who belong to a meaningfully shared world, where the loss of an other profoundly problematizes the borders of self, world, and other. Through mourning, crows become together. Van Doren suggests that crows can teach us to mourn, to become at stake in multi-species interdependency. This is especially true during this 6th mass extinction, where some corvid species, like the Hawaiian crow and the Kauai-o'o, are extinct or going extinct. Van Doren points out that extinction destroys not only the individual creatures and their branch, their species, but also their nature cultures, their ways of being in the world. He tells the story of the last Kauai-o'o, a male bird who, alone in a cage at a conservation center, spent the last days of its species and of its life crying mating calls for a mate who will never come. This Kauai-o'o asks us to consider, how do we mourn when mourning itself is going extinct. The bird's call embodies what Deborah Bird Rose calls howling in her essay, In the Shadow of All This Death, writing, "We howl in the dark for the loss that surrounds us now and for all that is coming. Our howling starts from within, from empathy, grief, and much more, and it reverberates beyond us. At the same time, other howls reach us and penetrate us, amplifying not only our voices but our meaning, as we are now within the sixth mass extinction event on Earth, and as we are its cause. We are howling into and from an extremely complicated place, the shadow of the Anthropocene." Tom Van Doren also taught me to see vultures anew. We normally see them as scavengers, but Van Doren sees them as composters. Their stomach acid is so strong that by eating road-killed animals and other carcasses, they cleanse the body of toxins, which prevents the pollution of local waterways. They, along with mushrooms and other scavengers, are some of the creatures which shore up some of the tributaries that flow from this torrent of climate destruction that our species has caused. Vultures also, perhaps, provide a vision for a better future amidst the ruins of capitalism and climate change, as Katie Fallon writes in her book, Vulture, The Private Life of an Unloved Bird. A turkey vulture is a perfect creature. It is neither prey nor predator. It exists outside the typical food chain beyond the kill or be killed law of nature, although without death it would starve. On 6-foot wings, it floats above our daily lives, waiting for the inevitable moment that will come to each of us, to every living thing. Then the vulture transforms these transformations, these deaths, into life. It wastes nothing, it does not kill, it is not a murderer, and it is not often murdered. The turkey vulture waits and wanders on its great wing sails. Following the magpies and the vultures, I began searching for roadkill, for stuff beside the road that has been abandoned, crushed by cars, rained on, walked over, discarded. I especially looked for wood, grasses, petals, and other natural materials, and for clothing, bedclothes, shoes, and other materials that used to be close to human bodies. I also looked for road-killed animals, which in Seattle are mostly rabbits. Following vultures, I took these road-killed materials and composted them, making them into new, precarious, and precious structures. Following magpies, I made these structures as embodied howls, lamentation prayers for the creatures and communities I had lost, and the losses connected to those losses. Howls and composting gave me mourning practices that turned my grief away from the harm of self and others and towards interdependence. I included one of those structures, home for the Bachman's warbler, over there on the wall. Another practice I did was make memorial shirt poems like this one here, a practice inspired by my neighborhood. In one of the videos that I sent out before the gathering, I'm tearing one of those shirts and using it to weave myself into the forest. On the inside of the shirts, I had written the names of those that I had lost and the losses connected to those losses, including the names of extinct species from North America and people killed by the police in my city. On the outside, I made a web of liturgies, lyrics, and mushroom drawings, webs, birds, and poetry related to those places and creatures. When I listened to Hannah's very eloquent plenary on naming and christening, I thought of the names on those shirts. The brief braid we'll make after lunch will involve a similar naming process, but on paper, not clothing. One of the things that we'll do is write out the names of those people, creatures, places, ecologies, communities we're grieving on a piece of paper, holding them in our hearts and our minds and naming them before God. We will tear those papers and weave them into fabric that I found here in Monrovia, along with the objects that I hope some of you brought from home. And if you didn't bring anything, I invite you to find 1 or 2 objects during lunch or during the hike Reagan is leading. As a reminder, you're looking for things in places you're mourning, places you're attending to creation, and also, this is probably the most relevant if you're looking for things here, precarious places, alleys, ditches, gutters, sidewalks, that most people might not notice. The objects should be small enough to be tied into a fabric braid, and if they are big, there's still a way to work them in there. So with that, I want to invite you to join me in making this grief braid, which will happen, I think, at 1:45 rather than 1:30, here in the sanctuary. I hope to put into practice some of those responses offered to us by the plenaries, Hannah's christening, Jonathan's ideas of dying well, I think especially of the chickens being offered at the edge of the forest, and Chet and Elaine's making this abstract climate grief tactile, something you can literally hold, and relational, something we do together, trying to braid ourselves together and into the earth. I would like to end this talk by performing a portion of my essay poem as a way of doing a morning practice in community with you all. This is, in a sense, my howl. Being alive, we are vulnerable to each other. We contaminate each other, we permeate each other, we breastfeed, nuzzle, resuscitate each other, and also maim, beat, run over. We are given over, beating and breastfeeding, breastfed and beaten, precarious bodies entangled. This is not a human condition, but a condition of life, of all creatures in the web of multi-species worlds that make up this muddy earth. Our bodies are full of bacteria, cells and relationships, networks of nerves and veins. Diseases move from one body to another, from one species to another. The redwood forest is one root system wrapped in fungal mycelium networks. We are all lichens. These ties constitute what we are. These ties and bonds compose us, and we compose and decompose each other. Before you, my pores are open, my shirt is torn, my skin an open border. But in the Capitalocene, the colony, the plantation, the capitalist colonizer enforces, as Butler writes, the prerogative only and always to be the one who transgresses the boundaries of others, but never to be in the position of having one's own boundaries transgressed, to beat, but never be beaten, to kill, but never be killed. The capitalist colonizer controls or attempts to control who dies and who is mourned. They are protected, we are protected by armies upon armies, while those they dispossess are made ungrievable. To enforce colonial impermeability, to ensure the ever expansion of capital, the ungrievable must be negated again and again and again. In the Capitalocene, the colony, the plantation, they attack funerals. Father Gustavo Gutierrez writes, the poor are those who die before their time. In the Excelsior, my neighborhood, people die before their time. In the last 2 years, 5 young men who I grew up with have been killed, all 5 shot, 1 in a car, 4 at playgrounds. Friends and friends of friends. This grief web is for them. In San Francisco, my city, the police killed at least 58 people since the year 2000, most of whom were homeless. Mission Local keeps a record of their names, and under some they've written, at least 43 people were later arrested in a protest over his death. Under many, the family unsuccessfully sued the city for wrongful death. Under others, his body was not claimed by relatives. This grief web is for them. In this earth, our home, non-human people groups, which is to say species, die before their time. We are experiencing the 6th mass extinction. The current rate of extinction is hundreds, perhaps thousands of times higher than the natural baseline rate. Species on species on species are dead and dying. This grief web is for them. Those who die before their time, this grief web is for them. Those whose bodies are not claimed, this grief web is for them. And those whose funerals are attacked, this grief web is for them. Job stood up and tore his robe in grief. I write your name against my skin, I tear my shirt. Highways. Highways are structures of premature death, highways in their cars, those metal death boxes that cut across the land, dividing, making ghettos, distributing precarity, creating roadkill, road killing. A year ago, my brother, partner, and I were almost killed by a driver running a red light. A few months later, my grandparents were almost killed in another car accident. My grandmother's bones broke and had to be regrown and in some cases replaced. Yesterday, I saw a rabbit roadkilled on Nickerson Street, a little body crushed into the concrete, run over and over. Look, remains on the highway, pigeons and coyotes and rabbits and children, almost me, almost you. What remains? which is to say whose remains. Now vultures. Vultures have a bad reputation with humans. We prefer to eat animals killed in hidden slaughterhouses. We never think about what we call meat, flesh, which has been transformed into a sleek product and subsidized by the American government. We prefer flesh that is always already raw material. The president pardons one turkey on Thanksgiving, absolving us, and we consume. Vultures, we think. Those scavengers, good for nothing, can't hold down a job to save its life. Criminal street thug thief vultures, they prey on the dead. I'm no vulture, we say, and keep driving. No, stop. Go backward, turn and return. What do we know of death? We poison the earth with formaldehyde rather than letting our bodies decompose, but vultures, they know death. Vultures do not kill, they compost. Vultures attend to the remains. When a vulture eats a body, the body is cleansed. When a vulture eats a body, the body becomes compost, that which composes the stuff of life. When a vulture eats a body, death is transformed into precarious life. How to become vulture, or how to become compost. Following vultures and those who follow vultures, I came across this grief web story told by Tom Van Doren. For thousands of years, the Parsi community of Mumbai and their Zoroastrian ancestors have mourned with vultures, specifically the Indian whiteback vulture, Gyps bengalensis. According to their ancient funerary practice called Lokamani Shini, the Parsi people placed the bodies of their dead in stone towers, towers of silence, to be exposed to the purifying rays of the sun and the beaks of the vultures. For the Parsi, vultures are the caretakers of the dead. But today in Mumbai, there are no vultures. In the last 20 years, vultures have been, quote, unintentionally poisoned by diclofenac, a veterinary drug given to the cattle they consume. In cows, diclofenac treats inflammation, but in vultures, it causes inflammation and swelling and kidney failure and eventually death. Millions of vultures have now died this way, Van Doren tells us, an estimated 97% of their number gone in just 2 decades. Now this species, which was once one of the most thriving vulture populations in the world, is going extinct. There are no more vultures, and so there is no more Dakameni Shini. How to mourn when mourning itself is going extinct. How to decompose when the decomposers are no more. What remains, which is to say whose remains? This body broken for you, this blood shed for you. Take and eat. Do this in remembrance of me. One last tale of mourning, this time following Van Doren, we turn to crows. We live in a time of extinction when certain corvid species are going extinct, including the Hawaiian crow, and have gone extinct, such as the Kwai-o'o. In this time of extinction, crows mourn. When so many are ungrievable, crows grieve. To follow them, we might start with the funeral. Here, near beside the road-killed magpie, the kin of the dead bird are here attending to the remains. The magpies press their beaks to the bones of their kin, then throw their heads back, their faces turned to the sky and howl. Mourning with magpies, we relearn our worlds. We become at stake in each other, bound up in a meaningfully shared world. Mourning with magpies, we become responsible, and able to respond to the loss of others. And so, how to grieve, how to speak the unspeakable. The magpies teach us howl. And so I will end with my howl in the hope that my howl will join in the howls of the magpies and the vultures and all the extinct birds, and that my howl might reach you and penetrate you, might bind you and me together in this grief web. I could tell you people and I could tell you places. Old man on the sidewalk in Daly City, classmate in a parking garage, San Mateo. Grandma in the bathroom, fruit fry at my fingertips, auntie in the birth wing of the hospital, coyote on the 101 highway outside Pacifica, 4 childhood friends at 2 playgrounds, cormorant by the canal, farm workers at the farm, dancers at the dance hall. I could tell you the names of people my age killed in my neighborhood since 2020. Leo, Kieran, A.T., Sean, Goose, Brandon, Cesar. And those are just the names I know. I could read to you Mission Local's record of every person killed by SFPD since 2000, and those are just the names they know. I could tell you relationships. My three grandmothers, childhood friends, classmates, friends of friends, neighbors, siblings, kin. I could tell you categories. Gang violence, police killing, roadkill, car accident, hate incident, senseless violent, sixth mass extinction, endangered species. I could break those words with other words. Animal species, rather non-human people groups extinct in North America, rather Turtle Island since 1492, Excelsior mob gang member, rather poet, artist, friend, brother, dead, rather killed, road killed, rather road killing. I could tell you weapons, guns, knives, hands, motorcycle, car, taser. I could tell you, send you links to news stories, to pages on IMBD, to vigil invitations to the song my dead friend made about his dead friend before he died, to all those Instagram posts with those shitty little sentences we put out there trying to say something, anything, fly. Hi, case mix. It's a worse in Frisco right now, prayers up. It's crazy how it's all these people we grew up with passing away, rest in peace, in loving memory. Fly high, case mix. All the ways we tried to keep their memory, quote, alive, so they, quote, live forever. I could ask you to donate to their GoFundMes. I could copy paste the GoFundMe eulogies, the traces and shadows of presence on the World Wide Web. I could tell you about kids I knew who killed and were killed. I could tell you about the first week of April 2022. 4 died in 1 week and all of them shot at playgrounds. I could tell you things I don't know, like who's in jail and who isn't, and things I do know, like who's dead, dead, dead. I could tell you about clicking links with a pounding heart, trying to find out, is that the kid I knew? Is that our Kieran, our Brandon, our AT? About not wanting to read all the think pieces about Asian American hate crimes because the kid who killed Vijay Ratana Bhakti is my elementary school friend, and I watched. And I just keep thinking about his smile, and I sat there and I watched us all. Everyone disowned him on Instagram. I could tell you about running barefoot through Seattle the night I found out because I wasn't even fucking home to be with them. Ask, do I even have a claim on these deaths? Well, these deaths sure as hell have a claim on me. I could tell you about that phone call from my mom, grandma dead in that house with no right angles. Listen, listen, listen. I could tell you. Names on names on names on names of kin of kin of kin of kin of dead on dead on dead on dead on dying on dying on dying about wanting to die with them. Release me about wanting to kill the one who killed them. Relieve me of Kay died for Goose and who dies for Kay. And so they, we, I. Kill, 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 die, wanting to claim these deaths, claim on my life. Baptism, litany, who has a claim on us? On me. I claim you. Claim on each other, my brother, my mother, my kin. I could tell you about how it took me a year to listen to the song he wrote about his friend who died, and it's like hearing ghosts, and I sat there and I transcribed every word for this goddamn project. Do you hear him calling? And I sat there and I listened to every song of extinct birds that I could find, Hawaiian crow crying, listen, for a mate who will never come, never come. Name us, name me, my dead, my dead, my dying, kin of kin of kin of kin of kin of kin. And so here we are, following the magpies. Here we are, becoming compost with the turkey vultures. Become together, for we must become together, or we will not become at all. Follow them. Press your beak to the bones of your kin. Turn your face to the ground, and then to the sky, and howl.